I have to apologize. My French is très mauvais, so I will be speaking in English. Please forgive me for that, and being typically English and only really speaking English. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. I'm very happy to tell you a little bit about Rust and the Rust Foundation. Before I start, how many people here already code in Rust to some degree? Okay, so about half. That's good. So some of you hopefully will be learning this for the first time. Some of you will know some of these things already. What is Rust? Well, it is a blazingly fast open source language, open source highlighted because that's incredibly important. It's memory safe, efficient, with no runtime or garbage collector, and it can power performance critical services, run on embedded devices, and easily integrate with other languages. It has great documentation. The people who learn Rust hopefully would agree with that. It's a friendly compiler with useful error messages and top-notch tooling. Overall, we think it's a fantastic language. Sure, there's some things which need focus and work, but overall, we think it's one of the most exciting and dynamic languages that exists today. A little bit about the history of Rust. It started in 2006 as a research project. Graydon Hoare, who is one of the advisors to the Rust Foundation, started it. In 2009, Mozilla formally adopted it and started sponsoring it as a project. It successfully compiled itself in 2011, and the first stable release was in 2015, Rust 1.0. We've just passed Rust 1.70. In 2020, Mozilla restructured and wasn't able to provide the institutional support it had been giving for Rust up until that point. So it had been providing staff. It was the legal home of the language. And then the Rust Foundation was created to take over some of those roles in 2021. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that shortly. So who uses Rust? This list could have been very, very long indeed. I won't go through them all, but just to give you some idea of the kind of organizations that are using Rust, we're talking about most of the major software services, technology companies in the world are using it. And interestingly, it's being increasingly used in safety critical markets like automotive, aerospace, and locomotive. We're seeing it increasingly used in gaming, and things like Dropbox rely heavily on Rust, Netflix uses Rust, AWS significantly using Rust. This is not a small niche language that is only used by people for their own personal projects. This is a language that is being used by some of the largest technology companies in the world. Rust has 3.7 million users worldwide. This is the most recent state of the developer nation. You can see Rust there, 3.7. And you might think, well, okay, that's still number 11 on that list. However, in the context of that number, Rust has more than tripled the size of its community in the past 2 years. So you can see this line gradually making its way up, just overtaking Objective-C there. That is clearly a phenomenal rate of growth for any language. One of the things that makes Rust incredibly special and increasingly important is its energy efficiency. Now, this is a fairly lengthy table, but the main takeout is there was a study carried out that ran 10 benchmark problems on 27 different languages and looked at the execution time, energy consumption, and peak memory use. And the critical thing is how much more energy efficient Rust and C are compared to many of the other languages. So 98% more efficient than Python, 50% more efficient than Java. It's one of the reasons that increasingly that if you're running very large services and you're thinking about your carbon footprint and you're thinking about your energy bills, particularly at the moment, then it makes sense to look at retooling your systems in Rust. This is probably quite a hard, it's not too bad actually at this size. Rust is the most admired language So this has just came out the last week, I think it was. This is the Stack Overflow Developer Survey. Over 87,000 people surveyed, and you can see that it comes out very highly, 85% rating on admired. It is generally considered to be a language which is respected and popular, and one that consistently comes up as being a language that people want to learn. Now, those of you who know about Rust already probably will know the answers to some of these things, but for those of you who are relatively new to Rust, there are some rumors around Rust, there's some things stated about it which it's good to know if they're true or if they're false. And to get the answer to some of these questions, Google surveyed more than 1,000 of their developers who had committed Rust code as part of their work in the last year. Now again, that gives you some indication of the scale of usage. That's 1,000 developers coding in Rust for their work in Google, and that's just the ones who responded to the survey. The actual numbers are much, much higher than that. So I'm just going to run through 5 of the rumors about Rust. So one thing that you'll hear time and time again if you're new to Rust or you're researching Rust is that it is hard to learn, that it takes 6 months or more to learn for the first time. Well, based upon the responses of the Google engineers, that's not simply the case. You had more than a quarter who were proficient in writing Rust after just 2 to 3 weeks, another 40% after 1 to 2 months, and by the time you get to 3 to 4 months, you've got more than 3/4 of the people who were surveyed saying that they can learn Rust. That's not to say that there isn't an ongoing demand for new educational resources and training videos, and particularly ones translated into different languages, but it does give you some idea of the I'm not going to say it's simple or straightforward, but I should have said from the outset, I'm not a technical person, so it's very hard for me to judge. And I should also say, I'm not going to be very good at asking any technical questions you have at the end, but I can take them away and ask my technical colleagues. But yeah, the prevailing rumor that Rust is particularly hard to learn, this is pretty good evidence that that's simply not the case. The next thing is that the Rust compiler is not as fast as people would like. This is true. However, there is a lot of work going on to speed up the Rust compiler to make it easier for people to be using. And as we'll talk a little bit more about Rust and the community, again, it's making sure we can get more support into Rust to help improve it is very important. Unsafe code and interop are always the biggest challenges. It's been debunked. Those are the 3 biggest challenges for Google developers: macros, ownership and borrowing, async programming. And again, these are all areas where the Rust team are working to improve things and make them better. Rust has amazing compiler messages. This is one of the things that people who code in Rust often highlight as being a significant benefit for coding in the language, is that the error message are incredibly helpful, and the vast majority of Google developers who code in Rust found this to be true. Rust code is high quality. 77% of developers were satisfied with the quality of the Rust code. 85% of them are confident that their Rust code is correct. It's not just correct, it's easy to review. More than half said it's incredibly easy to review. These are large numbers of professional developers being wildly positive about Rust. And so who or what is the Rust Foundation? Well, I should take a step back because I should probably not assume that everyone is familiar with how open source languages work. Effectively, you have vast numbers of volunteers. In the case of Rust, they number in the hundreds or even thousands who contribute code to the Rust repositories, which is all open source. It can be taken, used, modified by anyone who chooses to do so. It's overseen by a governance council, which again is made up of volunteers. It's recently been instituted with Rust, and they work alongside a number of dedicated teams for the language. But all of this means that effectively you have a language being operated and run by volunteers, and the language does need some official existence. It needs a legal identity for things like trademarking, running infrastructure services, etc., and increasingly for helping to directly support the language and the contributors to the language themselves. So we are a non-profit organisation. We are a 501c3 registered in the USA, and we exist to steward the language and the ecosystem. We want to support, sustain and grow the Rust programming language through strategic investment, virtual and in-person collaboration, training, education, promotion, collaborative governance rather, and technical infrastructure. What does this mean in practice? It means we provide and maintain the infrastructure, insurance, legal agreements, all the things that are necessary for running the framework of the language from a technical and legal perspective, though I should say that the infrastructure team itself is run by volunteers. We secure and distribute funding to maintainers, and I'll be talking about that shortly. We've now started to directly employ some engineers ourselves, who then work with the project teams on specific areas of Rust. We support events through funding and running them ourselves. We help spread the word about Rust, not just to developers who may be interested in learning it for the first time, but also for organizations who may be thinking about starting to use Rust themselves. And we're also focusing on security as a means to encourage the wider adoption of and investment in Rust. And I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. These are some, but not all, of our key partners who are members of the Rust Foundation, and they contribute funding to us. One of the big things is infrastructure support. So we support the infrastructure that runs the Rust language. As I say, it's managed on a day-to-day basis by a volunteer team, but for Rust to work, we need to be providing technical hosting and bandwidth services. The cost of doing so, which we pay for through a combination of donated credits and our own funds, is roughly $1.8 million a year, which is clearly a very significant number. And it's also one that is potentially increasing significantly as we see the usage of Rust increase. This nice example of the increase in usage of Rust. So this is crates.io. It is the Rust community crates registry. In the first 7 years of its existence, there were 25 billion downloads from it. In the first 6 months of this year, there have been a further 10 billion downloads. And since I put that slide in yesterday, there's probably been another 100 million downloads or so. It's increasing at an exceptional rate. But obviously, as I said, that increase in usage also then leads to increase in bandwidth. We serve petabytes of data a month in order to support the Rust language. Sorry. So one of the things we do, I mentioned earlier, is provide financial support to maintainers of the Rust code base, to people who run events and expand the usage of Rust in the community. And we do this through the Community Grants Program. There are a couple of elements to it. We provide things called Rust Foundation Fellowships, which gives a $1,000 a month stipend and a travel and training budget to people who are working on Rust. We've just closed our 2023 round on Friday, and we had over 150 applications. Unfortunately, this year we can only afford to fund 12 places, so there are going to be some tough decisions. But again, to give you some idea about the growth of Rust, when we first set this up last year, we had about 30 applications. This year, both the usage of Rust and the awareness of the foundation and the fellowships has increased significantly, to the extent that, as I say, we have 150 applications. A number of the people who we support through this are members of the core teams who work on Rust themselves. We also fund discrete packages of work that benefit the ecosystem as a whole. We call these project grants, and that is if there's a specific feature someone is thinking of adding and they would like some financial support to do so. if there's a series of bugs that need fixing, if there's educational materials that need creating. We ran 2 rounds of grants last year for these project grants, and we hope to be running another one later on this year. And we also have events grants and hardship grants. So we will fund meetups for local groups. We will provide funding and sponsorship to various Rust conferences and events around the world. And we will, in exceptional cases, provide hardship grants to members of the community who are facing particular financial stress, where we can potentially give them some assistance. Now, one of the main things that occupies us, and we are very keen that more people are aware of, is the extent to which Rust in particular, but also open source software in general, simply needs more support. I mentioned a large list of companies at the start who are using Rust and making millions, if not billions of dollars as a result of doing so. And yet the ecosystem that supports Rust is largely volunteer-based. These are people who are sacrificing their own time without reward in order to help and support the language because they care about it, because they love the language. In some cases, you will have people who are paid by their employer and then are able to volunteer some or all of their time to work on Rust, and that's fantastic. But most people do not get an appreciable level of compensation for the time that they spend on Rust. And we are desperately keen for more organizations to be funding both Rust in particular and open source in general, because it seems just deeply unfair and unsustainable that these vital pieces of our infrastructure of our modern world are based upon volunteer labor that is not adequately supported. And so we are very keen for organizations to be That's okay. Sorry about that. So yes, we are very keen for organizations to be contributing to foundations such as ourselves, to be being able to award more grants, be able to provide more direct funding, to be able to employ more engineers, and also to be directly donating the time of their employees to help work on and support Rust and other open source languages. I mean, and just simply things like, as I said before, supporting the infrastructure. We are very fortunate in the generosity of the organizations who provide us free credits for processing and for bandwidth and for storage. That's incredible and fantastic. But we need to be... So yes, so that's just a general comment about Rust and open source in terms of the desperate need and the gulf between the amount of time and energy and effort put in to support these languages and the amount of support given to them. What is our vision for Rust as a foundation? We'll effectively want to continue what people are thinking and saying already, which is that we are a safe, secure, sustainable language that's trusted by individuals and governments, that's maintained, and this is particularly important, by a well-resourced, well-supported, inclusive and diverse global community. There are so many people putting hundreds and thousands of hours of their time into Rust, and we're desperately keen to see them being supported as best they can. And following on from that, the companies that benefit most from Rust continue to be active supporters of this, or if they're not supporting already, they start supporting Rust and they start supporting the community of volunteers. And finally, we're keen to see more investment in Rust education, particularly in translations. Most of the materials, the most popular materials are obviously available in English with some translations into other languages, and we're keen to see an increase in the level of accessibility for people who want to learn Rust and for whom English is not their first language. That, I realized, was much faster than my allotted time. When I looked at my slides, I thought, okay, I'm going to talk much more slowly than I clearly did. So I hope that's not a problem. But yeah, if not, I'm sure there are more things I can say. Or if there are questions from the floor, I will happily answer them.
We have plenty of time for yes, please wait. So let's thank you very much for this presentation. I'm asking myself a question comparing with the Linux Foundation.
Yeah.
Do you see today in the ecosystem companies like Red Hat, that is to say, selling services around Rust, so that a company that wants to run and to use Rust can rely on such services to get bug correction, etc.
I think it's a really interesting question. I don't think we're quite in the position yet to be thinking about that for Rust, but I think it's clear that someone at some point will definitely be doing the equivalent of Red Hat, though I saw on the news today that also Red Hat has taken some actions recently which might not be wholly well received by the open source community. So I think that whoever is doing that needs to make sure that they are doing so in a way that is collaborative and supportive of it. But certainly, yes, my expectation is that there will be organizations, and there already are organizations like Ferris Systems who are providing certified versions of Rust and Rust training. So this is certainly a market that already exists and will only increase in future.
I may have a photo of myself.
Sure.
Would the Rust Foundation organize trainings that qualify people and certify that they have a little in Rust?
It's something that we are thinking about. We're literally just thinking about at the moment. I'm not able to say too much yet, but it is something that we are looking at exploring definitely.
Okay. Questions? Sorry, another question. I found it very interesting that the energy reduction aspect of Rust, because at ECE we are not concerned about what we call sustainable digital technologies, and my understanding is that Rust to be one of the technological answers to that. You have some kind of benchmarks of simulation to say that if in 10 years' time, if this part of industrial software is written in Rust instead of existing software, the amount of carbon emission you would avoid losing. Do you have this kind of simulation?
I don't, but Amazon, who funded that piece of research, may well have something similar. I don't know if they've been that forward-looking, but I certainly know it's something they've been interested in because clearly they're keen to understand how Rust will help them reduce their carbon footprint. But it's certainly, I think that kind of research will be hopefully hugely significant in causing other organizations to transition their code onto Rust. That's good.
You talked about transition because my understanding is that Rust is used to run from scratch a new project, but you see companies that transit, that can rewrite existing piece of software from existing software to a new version written with Rust, and what is the effect of that if they have done so?
Yes, that's definitely taking place, and there was a really good blog post, which I'm now trying to remember. I'll have to hunt it down, about one organization talking about their transition onto Rust and their experience with it, which was super positive. But so yes, it's definitely happening. And so far, the public expressions of the experience have been that it's been positive for those organizations.
There was a survey in the beginning about the popularity of the Rust language. Specifically, it's AR, VR, and gaming. This was very popular in, but it was not very popular in web and mobile developments. Do you have any thoughts on that and reading? Are you doing something to promote that?
So I need to make clear that we, as a foundation, we don't steer the technical direction of Rust itself, but I know that there is increasing interest in using Rust in mobile and developing in mobile, and that there's certainly development work going on that is looking at that. And again, similarly in web, it's something that a number of organizations are looking at. So that's I can get one of my more technical colleagues to give a better answer to that question.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. Is there some restriction to use Rust or the tools associated? in certain domain, like for example military domain or something like that? Is there some?
So is Rust currently being used in military development? Is that the question, or is
And is there some, for example, ITAR or something like that, some restriction to use some package or export restriction?
Oh, so
The US, for instance, can restrict.
Oh, right. Yeah, no, there's no way for them to put export limitations on Rust. As to whether I have, this isn't a politician's answer. I have no idea if Rust is being used in military systems at the moment, and they probably wouldn't tell me if they were using it. So,
Today in civil avionics software, only C and ABAP are official and certified language. You have some time to make Rust because it's a real very good candidate, and so to make Rust certified by Lazar and by FAX, etc.
So my understanding is that's something that Ferris Systems is looking at doing with Rust, and they're looking at specifically doing that certification. I don't think I can say which company necessarily, but I know that's definitely something they're focusing on.
Yeah, the people from another shop going to talk about it. Okay, you get them also about that. And the rest in the military, and the rest in the user for. Other questions? People in the back. Yeah.
Yes, I heard sometime that we can write some Rust tip driver in the Linux kernel. So what's the status with the Rust implementation in the Linux kernel, and if it's usable right now, and if it's used by?
That is too technical a question for me to answer, but I can try and find out during the next presentation and get back to you, or somebody else in the audience who's far more technical than me may already know the answer.
I can probably help on find some Linux torvalds and load Rust and drivers on the kernel back in November or December last year, I think. Some people are writing core utils. So Sylvester Blue from Mozilla is writing the core utils of Linux in Rust. As far as I can tell, I'm not sure there have been submissions of drivers in Rust already, but people are working on it. But it's official. I mean, it's allowed. You can do it. So if you want to contribute to driver to the Linux Foundation, written in Rust, you can do it.
Can you tell us more about the battle? There is our governance with the fourth, with the tribe, and all the discussion that we see in newspaper about the depth of the governance in Rust.
So the IAB talking about.
Yeah.
So you talk about the crowd math, or there seems to be anything happening with it. The last time I looked at the repo, I think it was intended mostly as a protest rather than as an official fork, due to how the proposed changes for the trademark policy were communicated out, which was something that we worked on with the project, and we both acknowledged that we could have handled it better. And we're in the process of working with the new governance council to make further proposals relating to that and take on board the feedback that we received.
Okay, so I think it's a non-story then.
I mean, I don't see it's, I can't, I think people's reaction to the trademark thing was understandable in many cases, but I don't think it talks to Rust being anyway not suitable for use or not being an excellent language that's robust and has a great future.
I'd like to mention that every time an open source project has trademark a name or a logo or something, the reaction has been bad every time in the last 20 years. And so history repeats itself. Another question? 1, 2, 3. Thank you.
Thank you very much.